He walked 12 miles, 90 years old, a canvas bag on his shoulder, and not a single person stopped to ask if he needed help. The August heat in Bell County, Kentucky sits on you like a wool blanket soaked in river water. It doesn't blow through, it presses in, thick and still, the kind of heat that turns the asphalt soft and makes the tree line shimmer at the edges. He walked along the shoulder of Route 119 with his head down and his jaw set, the way a man walks when he has already decided that whatever comes next cannot possibly be worse than what he just left behind. His boots, the same pair he'd resoled twice in the last decade, raised small puffs of red dust with every step. His left knee ached the way it always did in August. He didn't stop. Inside the canvas bag on his shoulder was everything he still owned in this world. A folded dress uniform, a photograph in a cracked frame, a Bible with his wife's handwriting in the margins, 3 days of clothing, and somewhere at the very bottom, beneath everything else, something he hadn't looked at in over 50 years, something he didn't even remember was there. He didn't know it yet. That's the thing about this story that matters most. He had no idea what he was carrying. The people who had taken everything from him, his home, his savings, the workshop he'd built board by board with his own hands, they had been thorough. Careful, they had looked at every account, every document, every corner of his life they could find. They were certain they had left him with nothing. They were almost right. His name was Harold Eugene Dempsey. He was 90 years old. He was a United States Army Staff Sergeant, retired after 32 years of service to a country he had loved without condition or complaint. He had survived Korea. He had survived Vietnam. He had survived the death of his wife of 41 years. And now, on a blistering Tuesday morning in August, he was walking 12 miles down a 2-lane highway in eastern Kentucky with a bag on his shoulder and nowhere to go. But the bag, that old, forgotten, sealed canvas bag, no one knew what was inside it. Not even Harold. Not yet. Harold Eugene Dempsey was born on the 14th of March, 1934, in a 2-room house on the eastern edge of Harlan County, Kentucky, at the foot of a ridge so steep that the sun didn't clear it until nearly 10 in the morning. His father, Orville Dempsey, was a coal miner who came home every evening with black dust in the creases of his knuckles and a quietness about him that wasn't sadness, it was simply the particular stillness of a man who had spent 8 hours underground and needed a few minutes to remember what sky looked like. His mother, Cora Lee Dempsey, née Blevins, kept a garden that ran along the south side of the house and grew pole beans, tomatoes, and a row of marigolds she said kept the beetles off. The marigolds never seemed to work, but she planted them every spring anyway, because she said some things were worth doing for the color alone. Harold was the oldest of 4 children. Below him came his sister Ruth Ann, then twin brothers Dale and Douglas, who arrived in 1938 and immediately became, in Harold's words, a 2-headed catastrophe. He looked after all 3 of them with the same steady, unhurried attention his father gave everything not hovering, not smothering, but present, always present. If Ruth Ann skinned her knee on the gravel path, Harold was the one who found the iodine. If Dale and Douglas got into it with boys from the next hollow, Harold was the one who walked down there and settled it, not with his fists if he could help it, but with a particular kind of calm authority that boys twice his size seemed to respect even when they didn't entirely understand it. He was not a loud child. He was not a showy child. His 3rd grade teacher, a woman named Mrs. Pauline Sizemore, who had taught in Harlan County for 30 years, wrote in a report card that Harold possessed a quality of steadiness that is rare in a boy his age and precious in any person. His mother kept that report card in the family Bible. It was still there when she died. He finished high school in 1952, One of only 11 boys in his class to do so, the others had gone into the mines at 16 or 17, following their fathers the way water follows a slope. Harold had thought about the mines. His father never pushed him toward them and never pushed him away. Orville Dempsey believed a man should arrive at his own decisions through his own reasoning, and that the job of a father was to make sure the boy had enough character to reason correctly. Harold had enough character. He had more than enough. In the spring of 1953, at the age of 19, Harold walked into the Army recruiting office in Harlan and enlisted. He had thought about it for most of his senior year. The Korean War was grinding toward its end, and something in Harold, not adventure-seeking, not recklessness, but a deep and genuine sense of obligation, told him this was where he was supposed to be. Orville drove him to the bus station on a cold April morning. They shook hands on the sidewalk. Neither of them was a man who cried easily, and neither of them cried then, but Orville held Harold's hand an extra moment and said, "You come back to us, son." Harold said he would. He meant it the way he meant everything completely, without reservation. He did come back, but not before Korea taught him things that no classroom and no hollow in Harlan County could have. He learned that fear was not the enemy paralysis was. He learned that the man next to you in a foxhole was your brother in every way that mattered, regardless of where he was from or what he looked like. He learned that silence could be a form of dignity. And he learned, in the particular and permanent way that combat teaches, that time was not something to be wasted, because it could end without warning and without apology. After Korea, Harold Ray enlisted, and then again. And then again. The Army became his structure, his community, his purpose. He served 2 tours in Vietnam in the 1960s, the first in 1965, the second in 1968, and came home from both of them quieter than he'd left, but intact. Not every man came home intact. Harold knew that, and he carried a private gratitude for it that he expressed not in words, but in the way he treated people, carefully, respectfully, as though each one was a small and irreplaceable thing. It was between his 2 Vietnam tours in the autumn of 1966 that he met Margaret Louise Combs at a church social in Pineville, Bell County. She was there visiting her aunt, a woman named Bess, who made the best apple stack cake in 3 counties and used that fact as a social weapon with cheerful shamelessness. Harold had been brought along by a fellow sergeant named Roy Tackett, who had claimed the social would be low-key, and who Harold would later describe as the most dishonest man I ever trusted. The church hall was loud and bright and smelled of wood smoke and cinnamon, and Harold had been standing near the back wall with a cup of punch he wasn't drinking when Margaret walked past him carrying a platter of deviled eggs and said, without looking at him, "You're either very shy or very bored, and either way, you look like you could use one of these." She held out a deviled egg. He took it. He didn't know what to say, which almost never happened to him, and she seemed to find that more interesting than anything he could have actually said. They wrote letters for the 14 months he was on his second tour. Long letters. Her handwriting was small and slanted slightly to the left, and she wrote about everything: her job at the county clerk's office, the book she was reading, the argument her Aunt Bess had with the choir director, the way the sycamore tree in front of her apartment building changed color in October. He wrote back about what he could, and about what he was allowed to say, and sometimes about nothing in particular. Just the shapes of clouds over the South China Sea and the way he thought about Kentucky when things were quiet. She kept every letter. He kept every letter. They were married in June of 1969 in that same church in Pineville, with Roy Tackett as the best man, a role he performed with considerably more honesty than his original description of the Apple Stack Cake social. They settled in Harlan County on Cutter Creek Road on 4 acres of land Harold bought for cash with money he'd saved over 16 years of Army pay. He built the house himself over 2 summers with help from his father and his brothers Dale and Douglas, and he built the workshop in 1974, a solid, wide-windowed structure of pine and cinder block where he spent his evenings making furniture that people around the county still use in their homes today. Margaret planted a garden along the south side of the house with pole beans and tomatoes and a row of marigolds because Harold had told her about his mother's garden and she said some things were worth doing for the color alone. They had 2 sons. Randall Orville Dempsey was born in 1971, named for Harold's father. He grew up gentle and bookish and eventually became a high school history teacher in Lexington, and he and Harold could talk for hours about the Civil War and never run out of things to say. Clifton Ray Dempsey was born in 1969, just months after the wedding a honeymoon baby, Margaret always said with a laugh, as if that explained something about his character. Clifton was different from Randall from the beginning. Not bad, not then, just different. Louder, more impatient, the kind of boy who wanted things to happen faster than they naturally did, and who grew into the kind of man who found ways to make that happen, regardless of who it cost. Margaret was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in 2009. She fought it for 3 years with the same quiet stubbornness with which she had done everything else in her life. Harold drove her to every appointment, sat in every waiting room, held her hand through every treatment without complaint and without drama, because that was the only way he knew how to love someone completely, without reservation. She died in the spring of 2012 on a Saturday morning in their bedroom on Cutter Creek Road with the window open because she had always said she wanted to hear the creek when she went. He held her hand until it was cold. He stayed in that house for 7 more years after she died. He kept the garden going, not as well as she had. The marigolds especially always got away from him, but he kept it going. Because it was hers, and because some things are worth doing even when they're hard. He fixed neighbors' fences. He made a rocking chair for the pastor's wife. He drove himself to the VA clinic in Harlan for his checkups, and he made his own meals, and he was, by any honest measure, doing fine. That was when Clifton started calling more often. That was when things began, very slowly and very deliberately, to go wrong. It began with concern. That is always how these things begin, with concern, with a soft voice, with a hand on the shoulder and a furrowed brow that looks like love and functions like a key finding the right lock. Clifton started calling every Sunday evening in the winter of 2019, which was more than he had called in the previous 5 years combined. He asked about Harold's health, about the house, about whether the pipes had frozen yet, about whether Harold was eating properly. He used words like worried, and we just want to make sure you're okay, Dad and Nadine and I have been talking. Harold answered honestly, the way he always answered everything, and he appreciated the calls more than he said, because he was 85 years old and the house on Cutter Creek Road got quiet in ways that were hard to describe to someone who hadn't experienced them. By February, Clifton was driving down from Lexington on weekends. He walked through the house with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving from corner to corner in a way that Harold registered but didn't name. He pointed out the loose board on the back porch, which Harold already knew about. He mentioned the gutters, which Harold had already planned to clear in the spring. He said twice that the workshop just sitting empty seemed like a waste, and Harold told him both times that the workshop was not empty. It had 40 years of his tools in it, and he went in there every morning to think, same as always. Clifton nodded and didn't argue, but his eyes kept moving. It was in March of 2019 that Clifton first mentioned assisted living. He brought it up carefully, sandwiched between other topics, the way you hide a pill in something sweet. He said he'd been reading about a facility in Harlan that had good reviews, that had veterans programs, that had people Harold's age who had become close friends. He said it wasn't a decision they needed to make now, just something to think about. Harold said he didn't need to think about it. He was 85 years old. He was in his own home, and he had no intention of leaving it. Clifton said, of course, and changed the subject. He changed the subject, but he did not change his plans. Over the next 4 months, the visits became more frequent, and the conversations became more pointed. Clifton began bringing Nadine, a compact, efficient woman with short auburn hair and a way of speaking that made suggestions sound like conclusions. She would walk through the house making small observations. This floor is uneven here, Harold. Someone could really hurt themselves, and the kitchen light is awfully dim, isn't it? And I wonder when this water heater was last serviced, each one reasonable on its own. Each one a tiny brick in a wall she was building around him. Harold noticed he was not a man who missed things. But he had raised Clifton, and there was a part of him that could not entirely believe the thing he was beginning to suspect. The first concrete act of betrayal came in July of 2019. Clifton arrived on a Thursday unannounced, which was unusual with a folder of papers and a man he introduced as a family attorney named Dennis. The attorney was young, perhaps 35, with a handshake that was too firm in the practiced way of someone who had been told that firm handshakes inspire trust. Clifton said he had been speaking with Dennis about getting Harold's affairs in order, which was a phrase Harold had always associated with dying. And he said it would give everyone peace of mind if Harold signed a power of attorney document giving Clifton authority to manage financial matters just in case something happened. Harold read the document at the kitchen table, slowly and carefully, because he was a man who read things before he signed them. The document was broad, very broad. It gave Clifton authority over bank accounts, property decisions, medical choices, and legal representation. Harold asked several questions. Dennis answered them smoothly, without hesitation, in ways that were technically accurate and fundamentally misleading. Harold asked if he could have a few days to think about it. Clifton said of course, and then sat at that kitchen table for the next 2 hours, talking about Harold's future security and Randall's concern, and what Margaret would have wanted until the sun went down, and Harold, who was tired and who trusted his son, and who had spent his entire life signing documents that put his fate in the hands of institutions he believed in, signed the paper. He signed it. That was the moment everything changed. Within 6 weeks, Clifton had added his name to Harold's primary checking account at First Community Bank in Harlan, citing the power of attorney. Harold didn't know this had happened until he went to the bank in September to withdraw money for a new set of router bits, and the teller, a young woman named Ashley, who had known Harold for years, looked at her, screened with an expression Harold could not quite read, and said his, available. Balance was $4,200. Harold stood at that counter for a long moment. He had deposited his pension check 10 days earlier. He asked Ashley to print a statement. She slid it across the counter with her eyes carefully neutral, and Harold stood there in the lobby of First Community Bank and looked at 6 months of his life draining away in transactions he had never authorized transfers to an account he didn't recognize, labeled simply household management. $47,000. Gone. He called Clifton that night. He stood at the kitchen counter with the bank statement in his hand and the phone against his ear, and he asked his son, directly and without accusation in his voice, to explain what had happened. Clifton's answer came without pause, which told Harold the answer had been prepared. He said the transfers were for Harold's care expenses, home maintenance, medication management, a cleaning service Harold had never seen or requested, and administrative fees for managing the power of attorney. He said it was all documented. He said Harold should be grateful that someone was handling these things for him. He said, and this was the sentence Harold would hear in his sleep for months afterward, "Dad, you're not really in a position to be managing this kind of thing anymore. That's why we did this. That's what this was for." Harold did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. But he stood in his kitchen on Cutter Creek Road and felt something shift inside him, not breaking. Not quite, but something fundamental moving. The way bedrock moves in an earthquake, slow and deep and irreversible. He contacted an attorney in Harlan named Patricia Goins, who had a small practice on the second floor above the hardware store and a reputation for taking cases that needed taking. Patricia reviewed the power of attorney document and told Harold as gently as she could that while the document was broadly drawn, it was technically legal, and that proving financial abuse through it would require documentation he may not be able to obtain if Clifton controlled the accounts. She said she would write a letter. She wrote the letter. Clifton had his attorney respond within a week, citing Harold's declining cognitive state, a claim that had no medical basis, but that landed in the official record like a stone in still water, sending ripples outward that Harold could feel, but not stop. In November of 2019, Clifton suggested Harold try the Maple Ridge Senior Living Facility in Harlan, just for the winter months. He framed it as temporary. He used the word temporary 4 times in one conversation, which Harold noted. He said the house would be looked after. Harold refused. Clifton nodded. 3 weeks later, a county social worker appeared at the door summoned. Harold later learned by a complaint Clifton had filed citing self-neglect and unsafe living conditions. The social worker was a kind woman doing a job she believed in, and she found nothing alarming in Harold's home, but the visit itself, the clipboard. The questions about whether Harold knew what day it was and whether he was taking his medications was a humiliation that sat in Harold's chest like a stone. By January of 2020, the savings account, the second account Harold held, with $14,400 in it, had been emptied as well. Patricia Goins filed a formal complaint with the Kentucky Adult Protective Services. The investigation moved slowly. Everything moved slowly. Harold was 86 years old, and the machinery of justice he was discovering was not built for a man his age operating alone. In March of 2020, as the world shut down around a pandemic that made everything stranger and more frightening and more isolated than it had already been, Clifton made his final move. He arrived at Cutter Creek Road with a truck and Nadine and told Harold that given everything going on, it was simply not safe for him to be alone. He said the facility had a COVID protocol. He said it was just until things settled down. He said it again, temporary. Harold stood in his living room and looked at his son and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has lived 90 years and learned to read people the way a good soldier reads terrain, that temporary was not what this was. But he was 86 years old, and the accounts were empty, and Patricia Goins' complaint was still moving through a system that had been further slowed by the pandemic, and there was nothing left to fight with. He packed the canvas bag himself. He put in his dress uniform, the photograph of Margaret, the Bible with her handwriting in the margins. He moved through the house one last time, touching things: the workbench in the workshop, the window frame he'd replaced in 1987, the south wall of the garden where the marigolds came up every spring on their own now, as if Margaret had arranged it so they wouldn't need tending. He walked out the front door of the house on Cutter Creek Road, and Clifton drove him to Maple Ridge and checked him in and left within 40 minutes. He didn't visit for 2 months. Then 3. Then the visit stopped entirely. 6 months after that, Maple Ridge informed Harold that his account funded by Clifton through the power of attorney was $4,800 in arrears. Clifton, when called, said he was reassessing the arrangement. The facility, bound by its own financial pressures, gave Harold 30 days. Patricia Goines, by now, had been told by Harold that he could no longer pay her retainer. The complaint she had filed was still pending, somewhere in a pile of cases that a pandemic had made mountainous. Harold Dempsey had survived Korea. He had survived Vietnam. He had survived the death of his wife. And now, at the age of 90, he was being discharged from a senior living facility with a canvas bag and nowhere to go, because the son he had raised and trusted and loved had taken everything and then stopped answering the phone. He was completely, utterly alone. It was the shoelace that started it. That is the ordinary, unheroic, entirely human detail that changes everything in the story, not a divine sign, not a stroke of fate, not anything that would look meaningful if you were watching from the outside. Harold had been at the Crestwood Motor Lodge in Pineville for 4 months by then, in room 7, a ground floor room with a window that faced the parking lot and a bathroom where the hot water took 3 full minutes to arrive. The motel was run by a soft-spoken Gujarati man named Prem Patel, who charged Harold a weekly rate and who left a fresh towel outside his door every Tuesday and Friday without being asked. Because Prem Patel was the kind of man who noticed things and acted on them quietly, which was the only kind of man Harold had ever truly respected. Harold had money barely, but enough for the moment. When Clifton had driven him away from Maple Ridge with the canvas bag and left him at a gas station in Pineville with $60 and what Clifton called a few days to figure something out, Harold had done what soldiers do when they are dropped in unfamiliar terrain with insufficient supplies. He had assessed, he had prioritized, and he had moved. He had walked to the Bell County Veterans Service Office, where a young counselor named Marcus Webb had helped him apply for emergency veterans assistance benefits that Clifton, in his thoroughness, had somehow neglected to cut off because they were federal and not connected to any account Clifton controlled. It wasn't much. It was enough to keep room 7. He had also, in those 4 months, done something else. He had begun calling Randall. Randall, the older son, the history teacher in Lexington, had been kept at a careful distance from all of this by Clifton, who had told him various versions of events that painted Harold's situation as a series of Harold's own choices. Randall, who lived 3 hours away and who trusted his brother more than he should have, had accepted those versions longer than Harold wished. But when Harold called him in October from the payphone in the Crestwood parking lot, Clifton had long since disconnected Harold's cell phone plan. Randall listened to everything. He listened without interrupting. When Harold finished, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to mean something, and then Randall said, "Dad, I'm coming down this weekend." He came. He sat in room 7 on the edge of the bed and listened again. And when he left, he had the name of Patricia Goines and a list of everything Harold could remember about every transaction Clifton had made. Randall was not a man of action in the way Harold was. He was a man of research and precision and patient effort, and he had spent the months since then working quietly and steadily to untangle what his brother had done. But none of that is what changed everything. That was the shoelace. On a Wednesday morning in late November, Harold sat on the edge of his bed in room 7 to put on his boots, and the left lace broke just snapped clean, mid-thread, the way old things do without warning. He needed a replacement lace. He did not want to trouble Prem Patel, and the nearest dollar store was 6 blocks away, which was not a problem for Harold even at 90 because he was still walking every morning, still moving the way his body demanded movement after a lifetime of it. He reached for the canvas bag on the chair in the corner, his army duffel, the one that had been on his shoulder for 12 miles in August because he had a vague memory of keeping spare laces in it years ago. Soldiers kept spare laces. It was the sort of thing you learned early and never entirely forgot. He lifted the bag onto the bed and unzipped it. The dress uniform was on top, folded the way he'd folded it the day he left Cutter Creek Road, with the creases still sharp despite everything. He lifted it out carefully and set it beside him. Beneath it was the photograph of Margaret Herr in the church garden in Pineville, 1969, 2 weeks before the wedding, laughing at something outside the frame. He held it for a moment the way he always held it, just a moment, just enough to remember the specific weight of that laugh. Then he set it down. Below the photograph was the Bible, and below the Bible was a rolled pair of wool socks he'd forgotten about, and below the socks, at the very bottom of the bag, his fingers touched something stiff and flat and papery, something that did not move the way fabric moves. That crinkled slightly under pressure, the way an old envelope does when it has been sealed for a very long time. Harold stopped. He reached in more deliberately and drew it out. It was a manila envelope, the old kind, the heavy kind, with a metal clasp on the back that had oxidized to a dull copper green. It was sealed with the clasp and also with tape-old yellowed cellophane tape that had dried and contracted and was holding on through sheer stubbornness. His name was written on the front in his father's handwriting. Not Harold Dempsey, not Harold E. Dempsey. Orville had written the full name, Eugene Harold Dempsey, in the careful, deliberate block letters of a man who had not written often, but who, when he did, made each letter count. In the bottom right corner, in smaller writing, Orville had written, Bell County. 1968. Keep this separate. Harold sat on the edge of the bed in room 7 with the envelope in his hands and did not move for a long time. The parking lot outside the window was quiet. A diesel truck idled somewhere on the road beyond the motel sign. The radiator in the corner of the room ticked steadily, throwing dry heat against the November air. Harold looked at his father's handwriting he had not seen in over 40 years, because Orville Dempsey had died in 1981, and the world had been slightly less solid ever since, and something moved in his chest that was not quite grief and not quite hope, but lived in the territory between them, in the place where old men go when the past reaches forward and touches them without warning. His hands were not entirely steady when he turned the envelope over. He worked the metal clasp first, bending it upward the way it was designed to open, though it resisted with the particular stubbornness of something that has been closed for 5 decades. Then, the tape. He worked at it carefully with his thumbnail, not wanting to tear whatever was inside, taking his time the way he took his time with everything with the patience of a man who had learned, in foxholes and field hospitals and at the bedsides of dying friends, that some moments deserved to be entered slowly. The tape gave way in pieces, leaving small ghosts of itself on the envelope's surface. He opened the flap. Inside were 3 documents, folded together. He drew them out as a single unit and unfolded them on his knee, spreading them flat with his palm, smoothing the creases the way you smooth a letter you've been waiting a long time to read. The first document was a property deed. Bell County, Kentucky, filed October 14th, 1968, in the name of Eugene Harold Dempsey. It described a 2.1-acre parcel on the eastern boundary of the county, identified by survey coordinates and bordered on the north by a tributary of the Cumberland River. Harold stared at the document. He remembered the land dimly, the way you remember something that was given to you before you understood what giving meant. His father had mentioned it once, maybe twice, in the early 1970s. A piece of land that had belonged to Harold's grandfather, Emmett Dempsey, who had worked it in the 1920s and 30s. Harold had been in Vietnam when the deed was filed. He had never seen this document before. He had simply, and he understood this now with a clarity that was almost physical, forgotten it existed. He read through the deed slowly, his finger moving beneath each line. The land was real. The filing was real. The name Eugene Harold Dempsey was his name, his legal name. The name on his original birth certificate and his Army enlistment papers, though he had gone by Harold his entire life, and the name Eugene had receded so far into the background that even Clifton, who had managed Harold's finances with surgical attention, had never connected it to his father. The second document was a lease agreement. A timber company, Caldwell Forestry Services of Barberville, Kentucky, had filed a renewable lease on the Bell County parcel in 1989, negotiated by Orville's estate attorney after Orville's death and renewed every 7 years since. The lease paid $340 per month into an account at the Pineville Postal Federal Credit Union, established in the name of Eugene H. Dempsey. Harold had not known this account existed. He had not known the lease existed. He had not known any of this existed, and neither had Clifton, because the name Eugene Dempsey had never appeared in any document Clifton had reviewed, and the Pineville Postal Federal Credit Union was not an institution anyone had thought to look at, because no one had known to look. Harold sat with the second document for a long time. He did the arithmetic in his head slowly, carefully, the way he did everything. 34 years of lease payments. 34 years of $340 per month going into an account he had never touched. He did not know what the balance was. He did not know if the account was still active. But the lease agreement in his hand was dated for a renewal period running through 2026, which meant the payments were still coming, which meant the account was still open, which meant there was money he had never known about in an account no one had ever touched, attached to land no one had ever claimed. It was the third document that broke him. It was a single sheet of ruled notebook paper, folded separately from the other two, with his father's handwriting filling both sides. It was dated March 1974, the year Harold built the workshop on Cutter Creek Road, the year Orville had come down to help him raise the walls. Harold did not remember his father giving him this envelope. Orville must have slipped it into the bag himself, the army duffel, that was hanging on a hook in Harold's workshop without saying a word about it. That was so entirely like Orville that Harold almost smiled. Almost, he read the letter. Son, I'm putting this here because you won't look for it, and that means it'll be here when you need it. The Bell County land is yours. Your grandfather Emmett broke that ground himself. It's filed under your full name because that's how it should be, separate from everything else, separate from family claims and family arguments and whatever comes later that we can't see yet. Your grandfather wanted it to go to the one who stayed steady. I watched you your whole life, and I know who that is. This land is yours, son, not the family's. Yours. Don't let anyone take what your grandfather bled for. I love you, Dad. Harold Dempsey sat in room 7 of the Crestwood Motor Lodge in Pineville, Bell County, Kentucky, on a Wednesday morning in November, with a broken shoelace on the floor beside his boot and his father's letter in his hands, and he wept. Not the way young men weep loudly, urgently, with their whole bodies. He wept the way old soldiers weep, quietly and completely, with his shoulders pulled in and his eyes closed and the letter held against his chest, because there was no one in the room and he did not need to hold himself together for anyone. He wept for his father, who had loved him in the wordless and practical way that men of that generation expressed love by filing a deed, by writing a letter, by slipping it into a bag 40 years before it would be needed. He wept for Margaret, who was not here to see this. He wept for the 7 years he had spent alone in the house on Cutter Creek Road after she died, keeping the garden going, keeping the marigolds coming up. He wept for the workshop and the tools and the photograph and the pension and everything that had been taken from him by his own son. And then he stopped weeping. He folded the letter back along its original creases, placed it with the deed and the lease agreement, and slid everything carefully back into the manila envelope. He pressed the metal clasp down. He set the envelope on the nightstand beside the lamp where he could see it. He looked at it for a moment, this thin, ordinary object that contained everything, and then he reached for the telephone on the nightstand and called Randall. Randall answered on the second ring. Harold said, "Son, I need you to find me an attorney in Bell County. And I need you to come down here. I found something." The pause on Randall's end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "I'll leave in an hour." The broken shoelace was still on the floor. Harold left it there. He didn't need it anymore. Randall arrived at the Crestwood Motor Lodge at 7:30 that evening with a paper bag of food from a diner he'd stopped at on Route 25E and the name of an attorney written on a folded piece of notebook paper. The attorney was a woman named Beverly Strand, who practiced property and estate law in Middlesboro, Bell County, and who had, according to the paralegal Randall had called from the road, handled 3 adverse possession cases and 2 fraudulent power of attorney disputes in the last 4 years. Randall had not told her the details yet. He had simply said it was urgent and that his father was a veteran and that they needed an appointment as soon as possible. Beverly Strand's paralegal had said Monday morning at 9. Randall had said they would be there. Harold spread the 3 documents on the small table by the window while Randall sat across from him and read each one in turn. Randall was 55 years old and wore reading glasses now and had his mother's way of going very still when he was processing something important. He read the deed first, then the lease agreement, then the letter from Orville. When he finished the letter, he took his glasses off and set them on the table and looked at his father for a long moment without saying anything. Harold looked back at him. Outside, a car pulled into the parking lot and its headlights swept briefly across the ceiling and moved on. Randall said, "Dad, do you understand what this is?" Harold said he thought he did. Randall said, "The land is yours free and clear. It was never in Mom's name. It was never in joint tenancy. Clifton never had access to it because he never knew it existed." He tapped the lease agreement. "And this account has been collecting payments for over 30 years. Harold nodded slowly. He had done the arithmetic again while waiting for Randall to arrive, more carefully this time, and he had arrived at a number that he had written on the back of a Crestwood Motor Lodge notepad and left face down on the nightstand, because looking at it directly still felt like something that required adjustment. Randall picked up the notepad. He looked at the number. He set it down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile. Neither of them said anything for a while, and that silence was one of the most complete and dignified things that had ever passed between them. Beverly Strand's office was on the third floor of a building on Cumberland Avenue in Middlesboro, with a waiting room that smelled of old carpet and fresh coffee and had a framed print of the Cumberland Gap on the wall that Harold looked at while they waited and felt something settle in him, something geographic and deep, the particular comfort of a man who knows exactly where he is in the world. Beverly herself was 61, with silver hair cut short and a directness of manner that Harold recognized and appreciated immediately. She shook his hand, looked at the documents for 11 minutes without speaking, and then looked up and said, "Missy Dempsey, this deed is clean. Your name, your parcel, properly filed, never transferred, never encumbered. Nobody touched this land because nobody knew it was here to touch." She pulled up the Pineville Postal Federal Credit Union on her computer. The account was active. It had never been closed, never been accessed by anyone, never been connected to any of the financial maneuvering Clifton had conducted, because Clifton had never known the name Eugene Dempsey had anything to do with his father. Beverly made a call to the credit union while Harold and Randall sat across from her desk. She spoke for 4 minutes, then she hung up and wrote a number on a yellow legal pad and pushed it across the desk. Harold looked at the number. It was not a fortune. It was not a sum that would make headlines or change the larger architecture of the world, but it was $138,420, 34 years of $340 monthly payments, untouched, collecting modest interest in an account that had been waiting with the patience of something that did not know it was waiting. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the specific and unambiguous terms of Harold Eugene Dempsey's life, everything. Beverly Strand filed the deed confirmation with Bell County the following Thursday. She also, in consultation with Randall, contacted the Kentucky Attorney General's office regarding the fraudulent power of attorney and the documented financial transfers from Harold's accounts. The work Patricia Goines had begun in Harlan now found new momentum, new documentation, and a cleaner path forward with Beverly driving it. She filed for the power of attorney to be revoked on grounds of financial exploitation of an elderly adult, a filing supported by bank records, the timeline of transfers, and a sworn statement from Harold that was 12 pages long and precise in every detail. Because Harold Dempsey had spent 32 years in the United States Army writing reports, and he knew how to document things. Clifton learned what had happened on a Friday afternoon in December when a certified letter from Beverly Strand's office arrived at his home in Lexington. Nadine signed for it. She opened it at the kitchen counter and read it twice before calling Clifton at work. And when Clifton came home that evening and read it himself, he sat at his own kitchen table with the letter in his hand and experienced, for perhaps the first time in this long and deliberate story, the specific sensation of a plan coming apart at every seam simultaneously. The letter informed him that Harold Eugene Dempsey was the sole owner of a 2.1-acre parcel in Bell County, Kentucky, that a revocation of power of attorney had been filed with the Harlan County Court, and that the Kentucky Attorney General's Elder Abuse and Financial Exploitation Unit had opened a formal investigation into the transfer of funds from Harold's accounts between 2019 and 2020. The letter was written in Beverly Strand's clean, unhurried legal prose, and it did not gloat and it did not threaten beyond what was factually accurate, and that restraint made it more devastating than any amount of heat could have. Clifton called Harold that same evening. Harold let the phone ring. The investigation moved with considerably more speed than Patricia Goines' earlier complaint had managed, partly because the documentation was now thorough, and partly because the Kentucky Ag's office had made elder financial exploitation a priority in recent years. and partly because Beverly Strand was the kind of attorney who returned calls the same day and filed paperwork the same week. By February, Clifton had been formally notified that he faced civil liability for the $61,400 in documented unauthorized transfers, and that a judgment lien had been placed on a property he and Nadine owned in Fayette County pending resolution of the civil case. His attorney, not the young firm Handshake Dennis from 2019, but a more serious man he'd had to find quickly and pay dearly, told him plainly that the evidence was not in his favor and that settlement was the more reasonable path. Clifton did not take that advice immediately, because Clifton had never easily accepted being wrong about anything, but the machinery was in motion and it would not stop. Harold did not follow the legal proceedings closely. He followed them enough to be informed, and then he let Beverly and Randall handle the rest, because he had spent enough of his life fighting and he was ready to do something else. What he did instead was this. In January, he drove out to the Bell County parcel for the first time Randall drove. Harold sat in the passenger seat with the deed on his lap along a gravel road that cut east from the highway through a stand of bare winter hardwoods, the trees silver gray against the white sky, the ground frozen and crackling under the tires. The parcel was 2.1 acres of mixed woodland on a gentle slope above the Cumberland River tributary, with a cleared flat section near the road where the timber company had maintained access. It was cold and still and smelled of frozen earth and wood bark and the particular mineral cleanness of moving water nearby. Harold got out of the car and stood on the frozen ground and looked at it for a long time. It did not look like much, in the way that most real things do not look like much from the outside. It looked like trees and cold air and winter ground. But Harold stood on it and felt his grandfather Emmett beneath him in the ground itself, in the idea of ground that is held and kept and passed forward, and he understood what his father had meant when he wrote that Emmett had bled for it. Not literally, but in the way that men of that generation bled for things quietly, over years through work and patience and refusal to let go of what was theirs. He bought a small, prefabricated cabin with a portion of the credit union funds, nothing elaborate, a single room with a wood stove and a covered porch facing east toward the river, and had it placed on the cleared flat section in the early spring. He did not move into it immediately. He spent 2 weekends in March driving out to the land and walking it, learning its contours and its sounds, the way the wind moved through the timber company's selective cut sections, the way the tributary sounded in the morning when the temperature was still below freezing and the water moved dark and quick between icy banks. He found, on the north edge of the property, a stand of old-growth poplar that the timber lease had specifically protected trees that had been growing since before Harold was born, straight and enormous and indifferent to everything that had happened in the world below them. He moved into the cabin in April. Randall helped him carry in the few things he owned. The dress uniform hung on a hook by the door, the photograph of Margaret on the shelf above the wood stove, the Bible on the small table by the window. Prem Patel from the Crestwood Motor Lodge had come out on moving day without being asked and brought a pot of dough and rice wrapped in foil, and he and Harold and Randall ate on the porch in the April cold, watching the light change on the tree line, and it was one of the best meals Harold could remember eating in years. He planted a small garden on the south side of the cabin that spring. Pole beans, tomatoes, and a row of marigolds along the edge, because he had learned from 2 women he loved, his mother Coralie and his wife Margaret, that some things are worth doing for the color alone. The marigolds came up crooked and imperfect and blazing orange against the dark Kentucky soil, and Harold looked at them every morning from the porch with his coffee and felt something he had not felt in a long time, something that was not triumph, not vindication, not the satisfaction of having beaten something. It was simpler and deeper than any of those things. It was just peace. The particular, hard-won, completely unspectacular peace of a man who is exactly where he belongs. He was home. Not the home that had been taken from him. Something older than that. Something that had been waiting for him underground, sealed and patient, the way all true things wait. He was finally, completely, irreversibly home. On a Thursday morning in early May, Harold Eugene Dempsey sat on the porch of his cabin in Bell County, Kentucky, with a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, and watched a pair of cardinals work their way through the marigolds along the garden's edge. The male was the color of something urgent. The female was quieter, more considered, moving through the orange blooms with a patience that reminded Harold of someone he had loved for 41 years. The tributary moved beyond the tree line, audible but invisible, a steady sound like breathing. The poplar trees on the north edge of the property stood exactly as they had stood for 100 years before Harold arrived, and would stand for 100 years after he was gone. The morning smelled of turned earth and coffee, and the faint sweetness of something blooming in the woods that Harold had not yet identified, and was in no particular hurry to. He was 91 years old now. He had survived more than most men are asked to survive: war, loss, betrayal, the specific and grinding cruelty of being made to feel small by someone he had helped bring into the world. He had walked 12 miles in August heat with everything he owned on his shoulder and no clear destination, and no guarantee that anything waited for him at the end of that road. He had sat in room 7 of a roadside motel for 4 months and made his calls and written his letters and eaten his meals and kept going, because keeping going was the only thing he had ever known how to do, and he saw no reason to stop now. What he had carried in that old canvas bag through the heat, through the humiliation, through every mile of that long August road was not just a deed and a lease and a letter from his father. He had carried something harder to name than that. He had carried the accumulated weight of a life lived without compromise, a life in which he had given what was asked of him to his country, to his family, to his community, and asked very little in return, and had trusted in the quiet and inarticulate way of men like him that the world had some kind of accounting for that. The bag had held that trust sealed inside it, folded beneath a dress uniform, waiting for the moment when he needed it most. His father had known. Orville Dempsey, a coal miner from Harlan County who had never traveled further than Knoxville, and who had written his most important letter on a piece of ruled notebook paper in 1974, he had known. Not the specifics, not the betrayal that would come, not the son who would take and take until there was nothing left to take. But he had known, the way fathers who pay attention know things, that the world was capable of leaving a good man with nothing, and that the best protection he could offer was not money or property in any form that could be easily found and easily taken. It was something hidden, something sealed, something that would only be discovered by the man it was meant for at the exact moment he needed it most. The civil case settled in March. Clifton agreed to repay $47,000 of the documented transfers, not everything, not justice in the fullest sense of the word, but enough that Beverly Strand called it a reasonable outcome, and Harold accepted it without bitterness, because bitterness was a weight he had decided he could no longer afford to carry. Randall called every Sunday now, without fail, and sometimes drove down on weekends and sat on the porch and talked about history and the cardinals and the old-growth poplar trees, and those Sundays were among the best hours of Harold's week. He did not speak to Clifton. He did not expect to. He thought sometimes, on mornings like this one, about the 12 miles. about the red dust rising from the shoulder of Route 119 in August heat, and his left knee aching and not a single car stopping. He had been angry then, not loudly, not in any way that showed, but genuinely and deeply angry in the way that a man gets angry when the world has arranged itself into a shape that is simply wrong. He was not angry now. He was something past anger, something that anger eventually becomes in a person who refuses to let it calcify into bitterness. He was clear. He was settled. He was, in every way that mattered, free. The cardinal in the marigolds looked up at Harold once, directly, with the complete and unself-conscious attention that birds and very old men share, and then went back to its business. Harold lifted his coffee cup. He watched the light come fully over the eastern tree line and fall across the garden in long, warm, specific bars of gold. No one had expected him to make it here. No one had expected there to be anything left. They had been thorough, and they had been certain, and they had been wrong, because they had never understood the most fundamental thing about Harold Eugene Dempsey, that a man who has lived 90 years with his integrity intact is carrying something that cannot be inventoried, cannot be transferred, and cannot be taken. It is sealed inside him. Fire. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because every week we bring you stories that remind us that even in the darkest moments, something extraordinary may still be waiting.